Happy Monday. Welcome to Sermon Scraps for this week. We wrapped up our series in Mark yesterday, and I promised that I would talk a little bit more about why there's that big, huge gap in note leading between verses 8 and the rest of Mark 16. And I just gave a little bit of why that's still in our Bible yesterday. It's primarily in there just because of tradition. But I didn't actually walk through those verses or preach on them just because I don't think they were in the original manuscripts. So why is it, like, what is the arguments that people make that would make one believe that those weren't in the original manuscripts? So most of the manuscripts that we have, something like over 95% of the manuscripts, old manuscripts that we have, contain verses 9 through 20 in them, believe it or not. Most of them. However, the oldest manuscripts that we have don't. We have a couple other flows of thought that lead into that. So people like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who were writing in the 2nd century, didn't ever talk about these passages at all, which leads us to believe that they were not in the manuscripts of Mark that they were using. A couple other things, like in the language that Mark is written in itself, the language that is picked up in verse 9 is really a lot different than a lot of the language that is used throughout the rest of Mark's gospel. For example, there are 15 words that are unique to use just in that last section, which is significant when you're thinking through like style and flow. Everyone, when they write or talk or whatever it is that they're doing, it kind of develops their own style, or like verbal tics or things that people do to try to just fall into. Like it's just this pattern that people start developing. But so similarly, with someone like Mark, his style is very similar through 16 chapters and 8 verses, and then suddenly there's this massive shift where the language, the tone, the themes change significantly starting in verse 9. Think of, well, just like the flow of thought that Mark is making here. So verse 8, they went out and fled from the tomb. So we're talking about those two women and two Marys. Verse 9, now when he rose. So suddenly we're talking about Jesus, but who is that he, the pronoun, referring to? We know it's Jesus. Like we know the whole picture, the story of what is being communicated here, but it's like this massive jump in subject matter from focusing on the women to now all of a sudden we're talking about Jesus. It just doesn't flow as well as most of the rest of the book of Mark would flow. The other thing, like, yes, it's not in the oldest manuscripts, but pretty much everything in these verses have other parallel passages in other gospels, which would tell us that these aren't untrue. They just weren't what Mark was trying to communicate in his writing of this gospel account. I'm just going to put a picture on the screen of from one of the commentaries that I got that's just like walks through a number of the verses that points out where in the other gospels you can find that exact story, that exact account of what is communicated in Mark's gospel. Now, one other thing is I got a text from someone asking, why is there this what seems to be this massive contrast in endings between Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel? So you remember, I even said this yesterday. Verse 8 ends, they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, if you take that and compare it to the resurrection account in Luke 24, it says, they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So we have what seem to be these contrasting accounts between Mark and Luke. What's interesting, though, and I read this in the ESV Expositor's commentary, I thought they gave a helpful summary of it. Mark doesn't actually tell us how long they were silent. It could have just been that they were standing there like shock and awe at the tomb, and then when they ran away, they started going to tell people about it. But I think if you agree with the argument that I made Sunday, that Mark is intentionally ending in verse 8 to try to drive the point, to force whoever is reading the story to respond somehow, like, this is how the women initially responded. How are you going to respond to the realities or implications of Jesus being resurrected? I think that would be a really good place to end, with the women just standing in awe, like not even knowing how to respond or engage, which continues, I think, doing a good job of driving that point of how are we going to respond to the realities of the resurrection. So I just want to talk briefly about that. This isn't the only section that is debated in the Bible. I mean, there's a whole section in John that we could talk about that we'll get to at some point when we do a sermon series through that. There's other verses that are supposedly missing in Mark's gospel that I don't think are always helpful going down or being distracted by some of those contexts. But I didn't want to talk about Mark 16 just because of that big note that's in our Bible. And just one brief note on that: if you have a good Bible, it will say that. So you can see it in the ESV, you can see it in the CSB, you can see it in the NIV. Good Bibles are going to help you get back to what the original and the best manuscripts that we have possible are actually trying to communicate. So there's, I mean, I had someone, a friend in college, not a friend, just an acquaintance. Had a couple classes with him, who was King James only. So it was very interesting. Anytime we'd have people do their Bible readings in class, he would always be using the these and thous. And I ended up taking Greek with him, which was really funny because my Greek professor had a bumper sticker on his door that said, King James Version, if it's good enough for Peter and Paul, it's good enough for me. So there's an entire segment of people that would argue that the King James is the only inspired and inerrant translation of the Bible, and that all these other modern translators are trying to lie and trick and deceive us by making notes like this or taking verses out of the Bible. And what it's discounting, like the King James version of the Bible was translated in the 1600s. The English language has changed significantly, as has our manuscript evidence to what the original autographs, the original writings that God inspired actually said. So if you want more information on that, I can share more of that with you. I just want to share a little bit about why some of these topics are important and why we should be aware of them and care about them. I would love to hear if there's anything that stood out to you from our study in Mark over the past year. It was helpful for me just thinking and looking at the lens of discipleship through Mark's emphasis in this gospel. And I love even just the way it ends of how are we going to respond? Are we going to choose to be disciples, or are we going to act like the original disciples and run away in fear? I have a few announcements for us coming up. So this Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. It's a bit of a weird year this year because Christmas Eve is on a Sunday. So just to give you a broad overview again, we'll continue meeting at 10:30 on Sundays moving forward for our regularly scheduled worship services. We'll be having a candlelight Christmas Eve service on the 23rd. That is a Saturday at 4:30 p.m. And we'll be having a regularly just normal worship service time on Christmas Eve, the 24th. And we're going to be looking at the 4 Christmas songs. I'm not going to give anything else away apart from that, but we'll be looking at the 4 Christmas songs over these next 4 weeks together, starting this coming Sunday. Tomorrow is also Giving Tuesday. I included something in the Friday news flash about that, and I'll send out another email about that. It's just a time to, if you would like to give to some special nonprofits or organizations that you care greatly about, and as you're thinking and praying about where to give, would you please consider giving to South Suburban? The last thing I wanted to mention is this Friday. It is an all-church decorating night. We'll begin that at 6:15 here on site. So would love to have you join us. We'll have some drinks, we'll have some cookies, and there will even be a movie for kids starting at 7 o'clock. So bring the whole family. We look forward to decorating the church together. Again, if you have any questions about this or you'd like to dig into any of these things that I've talked about further, feel free to reach out to me. And if not, Lord willing, we will see you on Sunday. Wait, no, Sunday. We'll see you Friday.